nature performeth her operations gradually. And indeed I would have thee do the same. Let thy imagination be guided wholly by nature, and observe according to nature, through whom the substances regenerate themselves in the bowels of the earth. And imagine this with the true and not the fantastic imagination. Oline once again, and salutations to the Truth Core, whoever and wherever you may be on the planet. I had a thought this morning. Odd, isn't it, how that happens? Do you ever have that experience? Having a thought? Do you ever wonder how you can have a thought? How you know that you have a thought? How a particular thought at a particular moment comes to your attention? Funny thing about the mind, it's full of thoughts and memories and fantasies and reveries. You formulate an intention somehow in your mind. And these are the productions of your mind, such as the thought I had this morning. And those productions come and go. But did you ever wonder what directs your attention to them at all? In Dog Zen, there's a saying: what directs your attention to the productions of your mind is not a product of your mind. So there's something working in your mind. I borrow the Tibetan term rigpa, that directs your attention to all the things that your mind produces, but that which does so is not itself a production of your mind. This is a fundamental teaching of Dog Zen. It's also the basis of a practice called honing rigpa, an extremely useful practice, not for some kind of spiritual development or anything like that, but for practical reasons. You see, if you hone your rigpa, then you acquire the ability to see how this directing force, this directing agency, which is not a product of your mind, selects and directs you, your attention, selects and directs your attention to the productions of your mind. And the more that you observe that, the sharper becomes your attention. And then when you have an idea, when your mind formulates an idea, it formulates it on that sharp point of rigpa. So you have ideas that become more and more well-defined and clear to you by the simple practice of that proposition, which is called counting to one. So, for instance, my rigpa, which is the same as your rigpa, by the way, although the productions of your mind in the total ensemble are different than mine, rigpa is the same for all of us. It's a factory installation. So this morning, my rigpa directed me to this thought, which I've had before. And when it comes back, it's crystal clear, and it's always stated in the same language. The admitted fiction is the more true. That's one version of it. The admitted fiction is superior to the non-admitted fiction. That's another version. The admitted fiction is more powerful than the non-admitted. And as an example of this statement, this assertion, which is an instruction of your own mind to yourself, I've spoken about Carlos Castaneda. And I've said that Castaneda's works are the warm-up act for planetary tantra, which implies, of course, my arrogant and self-important assumption that what I teach is superior to Castaneda. By the way, Castaneda is in my blood lineage in a way. I respect and love Castaneda, and I consider his work and mine to be complementary. But planetary Tantra goes much, much further than the Neo-Toltec sorcery of Carlos Castaneda. So I've often said that when Castaneda brought out his first book, The Teachings of Don Juan, he played a trick. He presented it as a dissertation for a PhD in anthropology, I believe, as if it were drawn from the field notes of an anthropologist studying with a Yaqui sorcerer named Don Juan. Now, part of that is true, because Castaneda did make such studies. He did do field research in Arizona and in the Sonora Mountains of Mexico. But most of what you find in that book and the following books is invention, genius level invention, but it's non-admitted invention. Whereas what I do, what I present, is admitted invention. Now, here's the point where a little objection might come up. Well, John, are you just admitting that you're making things up? The Sofianic myth, the Devadas and Dakinis of the Shakti cluster, and so forth and so on. Are you just admitting that you're making it up? And therefore, how can it be true if you're making it up? Well, there was an American poet named Wallace Stevens, quite an extraordinary master of language. He wrote the poem called The Emperor of Ice Cream. There are 2 lines in that poem that I often repeat. Let be finale of seem. The only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. One time, Wallace Stevens, who was an insurance salesman in Hartford, Connecticut, if you can believe that, and one of the most renowned American poets of the 20th century, was walking in the park with a student, and they were discussing fiction. What is fiction? What is invention? And at one point, Stevens turned to the student and he said, I think we've reached the stage now in the modernist, postmodernist mindset where we can't take anything to be true unless we ourselves have invented it. It's a wonderful anecdote, at least I think it is, from Wallace Stevens, and I believe you find it in a book called Notes for a Supreme Fiction. So you see, that statement of Wallace Stevens is a variation of what I've already said, and it's also a variation that goes back to the alchemical rule that I quoted in the beginning, which is from, I think, a 17th century alchemical manuscript called Artis Auriferae, or the art of gold making. And that passage makes a distinct difference. It makes a strong distinction between the true imagination and the fantastic imagination. So what is the difference? What is the difference in your imagination? Do you know, for instance, that when you're using your imagination, if you are using the true imagination or the fantastic imagination, which means that you are simply inventing things which are not true? How would it be if you had the complete, clear, and consistent certitude that you knew the difference, so that you could know when you are using, exercising, and expressing the true imagination and not the fantastic imagination? How can you establish that difference, maintain it, and exercise it when you use your imagination? You can find the answer to that question and the discipline that goes along with it in the practices of planetary Tantra. And as far as I know, you can't find them anywhere else. Correct me if I'm wrong there. Now, I'm not going to elaborate in a linear way upon this issue. I woke up this morning in a really pleasant, non-linear mood. So rather than approach the exposition, the further explanation of what I'm talking about in a linear way, I'm just going to move to 3 different points, which you can call points of reckoning, points on a map of the mind from which you can confirm the propositions that I've stated. One is a rule concerning invention. Now, I think that there is enough latitude, I suppose, I presume, I guess, there is enough latitude in your mind to accept the suggestion that when something is invented, it can have truth in it. Of course it can. For instance, Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Now that's a big, thick, powerful novel that tells a story which Dostoevsky invented. And when you read it and absorb the message in it, you come away with the truth of the story, the moral of the story, as it used to be called. You don't hear that saying anymore because stories today, movies, films, songs, performances, don't have a moral. They are immoral, and they are without purpose or significance. But there was a time when every good story had a moral. So Crime and Punishment has a moral, and you come away from it with the truth that the author inscribed into the story. Now, it's a fact known to scholars of Dostoevsky that actually at the time that he wrote that novel, there was an incident in St. Petersburg where a young man went to the apartment of a moneylender, put that in brackets, and took an axe, it was a woman, I believe, and stuck it in the middle of her face, right in the doorway. And this was an incident. Now, Dostoevsky used to read the newspapers, particularly, or with particular interest, toward crime reports and police reports. So, that being so, trusting what scholars tell us, we can infer that the invented narrative of Crime and Punishment was, in a sense, quote, based on a true life incident, end quote. But in and of itself, the act of a young man burying a hatchet in the face of a moneylender is just an incident. It's just a fact reported in a St. Petersburg newspaper in a small clipping. But the novel Crime and Punishment is a massive invention of creative writing that grew out of that, you see. And the fact that Dostoevsky invented the characters and incidents in Crime and Punishment, that he made it all up, of course, doesn't mean that it doesn't contain truth. Second point of orientation. There's a rule in planetary Tantra regarding invention, and it goes like this. Whenever you consider an invention, let's say invented stories, there are 2 criteria for that invention to be honest and true and to have a moral. The first criteria is that the invention has a source. It's based on something, like Crime and Punishment was based on a newspaper article. The second criterion is that the invention has a purpose or aim. So, for instance, take Zecharia Sitchin, widely recognized as having brought into the world what I call the Anunnaki scenario, said to be based upon Sumerian tablets. Now apply the two criteria. Upon what did Sitchin base the invention of the Anunnaki scenario? Well, he claims to have based it on cuneiform tablets. But that claim is dubious because some investigators have indicated that Sitchin was a fraud and a shill for certain parties, and that in fact he could not read 5 or 6 ancient Middle Eastern languages as he claimed. But anyway, give it the benefit of the doubt. Let's say that he did refer to cuneiform tablets, the stories of Enki and Enlil and the Great Flood. That was the source of his invention. But what was the intention of his invention? What was the purpose? Well, the purpose was, and is today, to convince those who hear the story that humanity is a slave species. You see? That's the purpose. So in every invention, in every film, in every novel, in every song or poem that tells a kind of story, you look for those two factors: the source of the invention and the purpose of the invention. And with that tool, you can evaluate the invention, the fiction, and you can determine by the capacities of your own discernment if it is worth your time and interest. Fiction is very powerful. Look at the Harry Potter series. Unfortunately, however, if fiction comes from the fantastic imagination and not the true imagination, its effects and consequences are not particularly good for the human animal. Third point of reckoning. There is no myth in the world comparable to the fallen goddess scenario. The most beautiful story on earth is the story about the earth, and it is the only complete and coherent story about the earth. Therefore, the FGS provides you with a narrative framework. Now, within that framework, there is room to invent and elaborate. Within that framework, there are inherent criteria, there are inherent guidelines for assessing other fictions, other narratives, other myths. Those who practice planetary tantra today, in the growing numbers, will tell you that by learning and loving the sofianic myth, their imagination functions in a different way. It is the myth to guide the human races. It is the story to guide the species. And as long as you stay in the narrative, this is the planetary tantra jargon, the narrative itself guides you to discover and develop the true imagination. At the bottom of all that, there is a very great fact. Everything that you imagine within the framework of the sofianic narrative is true, viable, verifiable, actionable, and reliable. But whatever you may imagine that is not within that narrative is dubious at best and seriously misleading at worst. I believe, I don't know, do you know? Do you know that I've often said something that I'm sure causes me to be immediately dismissed? When I talk about going into the nahual, into the supernatural, paranormal experiences, telestic sessions with or without mushrooms, generally with plant allies, I have said that those investigations for me have not revealed angels and demons. They have not revealed jinns and all sorts of demonic spirits, neither demonic tormenting spirits or angelic spirits and inspiring spirits. I don't see any of that. Tell me what you see when you go into the supernatural and into the paranormal. Perhaps because, certainly of course, because I follow a strict discipline in my shamanic investigations, I don't encounter any of that stuff. Angels and demons and radiant ascendant beings and fiends and ghouls. I don't encounter any of that at all. There's none of that in the supernatural, as far as I can see. Well, how can I dismiss all that then? Because there are so many accounts through the ages. There's so much testimony about people encountering spirits of a benevolent and malevolent kind, right? Whether or not they come from experiences of psychonauts, people who take DMT, LSD, mescaline, peyote, or whether they come from, as they often do, from a religious context. The religious saints, the saints of the deserts, tortured by all these demons. To me, that's complete nonsense. It's totally unnecessary. Those demons and those angels, both, are simply products of the fantastic imagination, and I have no use for them whatsoever. See, the human imagination is a tremendously powerful force. I've compared it to handing a fire hose to a 4-year-old child. If you use your imagination, you need to learn to use it correctly, and if you don't use it, someone else will use it for you. These are the brutal facts about human imagination. So it's great good news to know that there is a correct way to use the power of your imagination. Keep it in the sofianic narrative. Learn the narrative, and the narrative will show you what is true by contrast to what is fantastic in whatever productions of imagination arise in your mind. Enough said, and I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.